Today we're going to talk about the polio vaccines. So globally there's two different forms of the polio vaccine. We have the inactivated polio vaccine, which is the only type that we use in the United States. And then we have the oral polio vaccine, which is used in areas of the world where polio is still endemic. So areas like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Or in areas that are thought to be threatened in terms of reintroduction of polio. So the inactivated polio vaccine only contains killed virus. The virus is killed typically by exposure to formaldehyde. It contains all three serotypes and it's given in injection. The benefit to the inactivated polio vaccine is that there is no risk of infection from this vaccine, and you do get immunity in terms of protection against paralysis. What you do not get is protection from infection, or at least not full protection from infection. And so what this means is that even if you have immunity against polio for the inactivated polio vaccine, you still actually can get a polio infection. You have no risk of developing paralytic polio, but you can get an infection, and what this means, unfortunately, is that you can still shed polio virus into the environment. So we use the inactivated form in areas where polio is no longer circulating because there's almost zero risk of an actual infection in an area like the United States. Now the oral polio vaccine is a live weakened virus. So usually what happens is the virus is grown through multiple passages in something like monkey kidney cells. It accumulates a number of mutations that end up making it better at growing in those kidney cells, and it just typically turns out that that also makes it worse at growing in our gastrointestinal tract a little bit, and definitely worse at growing in our neurological system. So currently there are only two serotypes in the oral polio vaccine, only types 1 and 3. Serotype number 2 was declared eradicated in 2015, and actually serotype 3 was declared eradicated in October of last year. And so I'm going to get to in just a minute why we don't include the oral form of type 2 and why we eventually will get rid of the oral form of type 3 in this one. Again, this is an oral vaccine. The benefits to this one are that the immunity that you get actually is against infection. And so if you get full immunity here, you should not be able to become infected with the virus if you are later exposed. The other benefit to this is that immunity is lifelong. And so here, if you're looking at this, and immunity with the inactivated form is shorter. So if you're looking at this, well, you get better immunity with the oral polio vaccine, you get lifelong immunity, you get immunity against infection, which therefore also gives you immunity against the paralytic form. And so why don't we use this oral polio vaccine? Well, there's two problems with the oral polio vaccine. One is called VAPP. This is vaccine-associated paralytic polio. This is actually a live and attenuated virus, and it's weakened because of those mutations. In about 1 out of every 2.7 million cases, the virus manages to revert inside of an individual who's received the vaccine. And so essentially it back mutates, it becomes a fully virulent form. And so you can, in rare cases, end up with paralytic polio from the vaccine itself. And so in the decade and a half before we stopped using the oral polio vaccine in the United States, which was in the year 2000, we had approximately 150 cases of paralytic polio in the United States, and about 145 of those were from the vaccine as opposed to actual natural polio. The remaining cases of paralytic polio in that decade and a half were from travelers, people who had gone to areas where polio was endemic. So this is an issue. We don't want to risk paralytic polio from a vaccine in a country where we have no other polio. The other problem with this is that, again, this is a live attenuated virus. And so what you can do here, what you do actually, is you shed the vaccine strains for about 6 weeks following inoculation. Now, in an area with really high levels of immunity and good levels of hygiene, this should not be a problem. But in areas where we have poor sanitation and hygiene, people don't necessarily have access to clean water, and in areas where we don't have large numbers of immune individuals, either due to reduced vaccination, malnutrition, things like that, what can happen is the vaccine strains of polio can be picked up over and over and over again, passed from person to person to person to person to person over long periods of time. And eventually, here again, you can see reversion of that attenuation. So what you can end up with here, and this has been documented in a couple of rare instances, is reintroduction of paralytic polio into an area. And it's not the original natural virus, it's actually the vaccine strains that have reverted. And so in an area where polio is not at risk, where natural infection is not risky, the inactivated polio vaccine is sufficient. We can keep it under control. Even if polio were reintroduced to the United States, we would have protection against paralytic polio until we could start vaccinating with the oral polio vaccine if necessary. But in areas where polio is still actively circulating, and again, we have those 3 endemic countries, we cannot risk this continued transmission from natural infections. And so the only way to do that is to shut it down by giving people full immunity with the oral polio vaccine. Again, that does carry a risk of paralytic polio, although it's small, but it also carries a risk of reintroduction. And so what's been recommended is that as we eradicate the serotypes, so serotype 2 is eradicated, we take it out of the oral polio vaccine, so there's no risk of reintroduction. We only give type 2 in the inactivated form. In a few years, when we're really comfortable with the idea that serotype 3 really has been eradicated, it's suggested that we would take serotype 3 out of the oral polio vaccine, only give serotype 1, because that's the only one that's still naturally circulating, and then you would only get types 2 and type 3 in the inactivated form.